Welcome to the Content Repurposer podcast, where we explore innovative ways authors can repurpose their book's content for greater impact. I'm your host, Pooja Arshnapali, and today we're doing something a little bit different. Last year, I got to be a part of an anthology called Perfectly Imperfect, where a collection of women got to share their stories that they overcame. And the one thing that I had to overcome was the perception of being quiet. When I grew up, it felt like the perception of being introverted was a weakness, and I was never encouraged to be quiet. And it was never encouraged to be quiet. It was always encouraged to speak more. And it felt like at the time, if you were introverted, it felt like the more superior thing was to become extroverted. I would often get phrases like, "You're coming out of your shell," which I think to them, it came off as a compliment. But at the time, it kind of felt backhanded because it always felt like the perception of being extroverted was the more desired state. I remember this certain analogy in the book Quiet by Susan Cain, where she said that there are certain animals like turtles that live comfortably and well living in their shell, and there's nothing wrong with it. Instead of being introverted, but at a certain time taking an extroverted persona, I think the overall goal was to be extroverted. But it didn't just stop at subtle comments. It started to become more apparent and aggressive. I remember at school, I was always a concern to my teachers, and it was because I never really participated in class. And the reason for that is because I was aware that my voice was really soft and no one could hear me. And I always hated being the center of attention. I also didn't know how to project my voice, and it felt like I couldn't win or be able to get better because no one was telling me how to improve. It felt like I just had to talk louder, or it just felt like I had to be born with a loud voice. I remember there was one instance in middle school where I had to deliver a speech, and my voice was really soft that my teacher ended up curving everyone's grades. And I know what you might be thinking, that if someone's voice is really soft, it can be hard for someone to hear, and therefore it can be reasonable for it to affect someone's grades. And yes, I agree with you, but I was never told through the whole speech that he couldn't hear me properly. And because I didn't go first, he then realized that there were other people before me that he graded harshly on. And he wanted to update their grades, but after each speech, he went to each speaker in full volume, addressing that he made a mistake because he wasn't aware that there are other people with softer voices. There was probably at least 5 people that he talked to, which means that the whole class probably heard and knew that he was talking about me. And the reason why I brought this scenario is because this would happen a lot to me. People in my class would feel annoyed wanting to work with me on group projects because either my voice was too soft and they couldn't hear me, or I just wasn't a very social person to interact with. And they would outwardly make passive-aggressive comments, specifically saying that they didn't want to talk to this specific person, or they just don't want to interact with a person who is quiet. Now that I look back on it, I don't really understand why people felt so comfortable saying that out loud. It almost felt at the time that I was like this fly on a wall that people could just openly gossip about. But this type of interaction didn't just stick with school, it followed me everywhere. I would piss a lot of people off because I didn't know how to contribute to a conversation, and therefore I would just sit there and listen to a lot of people with their own conversations. I feel at least like in the United States, it's often a social norm to be extroverted or to participate a lot in conversations. And if you aren't doing that, then you're considered disrespectful. So some people would get offended, and some people would even get hostile and then try to force me into having a conversation. So I would be in a group of people, and then one person would make everyone in the group stop their conversation and then tell me that I just needed to speak. So it kind of felt like, when you are younger and your parents tell you to eat your vegetables and then you don't. So then you have to sit at the end of the table until you finish it. That's what it felt like. It just felt humiliating. I was a kid at the time, and most of these interactions were created by adults. I didn't have the maturity and the vocabulary to respectfully tell them how I felt. So I just kept quiet and I didn't really say anything, because if I felt like I said anything, I was just giving them power. So it was my coping mechanism, and it worked for a while until it didn't. I remember one time I was told by an adult that I wasn't capable of being a good mother because I didn't talk. I wasn't aware how much this hurt my feelings until later because I ended up carrying this with me, and I didn't believe for a while that I would be fit as a good mother. And it wasn't up until now that I realized where I got that thought from. So I continued to shut people out and I became more jaded. And it worked until I hit my sophomore year of high school when I joined the speech team. And I wanted to let you know that this probably wasn't my initial idea to do speech team. And I was kind of forced into it by my English teacher. So my English teacher was the head of the speech team. And the speech team we had, it wasn't debate, but it was more for people who wanted to act, deliver keynote speeches, and a lot more. My English teacher was worried about his speech team because most of the seniors were graduating and that was the bulk of his team. So he was on a mission to recruit the most amount of people that he could get. So every single day he would go to each student one by one and then say the same exact phrase. Hey, so-and-so, I think you would be great for our speech team. Everyone would shake their heads and then slowly walk towards the door. But he really didn't care if he made people uncomfortable. He was just determined to get people on his team. One day, he reached out to me, and at the time, I was really horrible at confrontation, so I ended up saying yes. But after some time, I felt like this would be a good decision for me because I was the person who was so afraid of speaking in front of the class that I would be contemplating of whether or not if I should just get a bad grade to avoid doing it altogether. I spent most of my time not talking to people and it worked for a while, but then I realized it was really hard for me to communicate my thoughts and I just didn't want to be afraid of public speaking and I didn't want to be limited. When I was on the speech team, there are different types of speeches. There is prose where you get to memorize specific scenes or stories from a book, verse where you memorize a poem that you deliver, improv, and there's so much more. The type of speech that I did was deck, and basically what that meant was I had to memorize a 6 to 8 minute speech, similar to a TED Talk or a keynote speech. So when I first started, I was really bad, but I guess that's anyone who is learning a new skill. I was really bad at memorizing, but what I was really bad at was being okay with sucking at something for a while. That was probably the hardest thing I had to overcome. But I also had to learn how to pace myself, maintain eye contact, deliver at a certain cadence, be aware of my inflection, and how to be more expressive when I talk. It made me realize a lot of people were ignorant on what it took to become a good communicator. It's not just about the volume of your voice, but there's so much more to it. At the time, I was so hard on myself because I was constantly comparing myself to other people on the team. And they were getting a lot better over the years, and I was not. But to give them credit, they worked a lot harder than me. And I was just such a perfectionist that it prevented me from even trying. I'm so glad that I wasn't good. And I know that sounds weird, but I ended up staying at speech team for 3 years. But again, I'm honestly just really grateful that I sucked at speaking because if I was so good, then I wouldn't have been motivated to take on leadership roles or positions after high school. And now I still continue to do so. I recently explored public speaking again in my business and realized it has been one of my strongest assets. And I'm really not the one to get sappy, but I'm so grateful for having a teacher at the time who believed in me and saw the potential in me before I even saw it in myself. And I think when you're a kid, you are so influenced by the people around you. It's just great to have someone who didn't see anything wrong with me. It made me feel like I just wasn't going crazy. And I just don't think that my life would be the same if he wasn't in my life. But that's all I have for this podcast episode. And I will provide the link to the anthology in the show notes below. But thank you so much for tuning into the Content Repurposer podcast. If you found value in this episode, please subscribe, share this episode, and leave us a review. Let us know in the comments below. Otherwise, see you in the next episode.